It's 1952, and American families gather around their black and white television sets every week to watch what they believed was the most wholesome, most perfect family in America. The Nelsons. Ozzie, the charming and slightly bumbling father. Harriet, the quintessential homemaker with her pearls and apron, always smiling, always understanding. And their two handsome sons, David and Ricky, growing up right before America's eyes. For 14 years, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet became more than just a television show. It became the gold standard for American family life, the measuring stick by which every household judged itself. But what if I told you that everything you thought you knew about America's favorite family was a carefully constructed illusion? What if the reality behind those cameras was so dark, so twisted, so heartbreaking that it would shatter the very image that millions of Americans held sacred for decades? Today, we're going to peel back the layers of one of the most elaborate deceptions in television history. We're going to expose the secrets that Ozzie and Harriet took to their graves. We're going to reveal the price that their children paid for being America's perfect teenagers. And by the time we're done, you'll never look at that smiling family portrait the same way again. Because the truth, as they say, is always stranger and darker than fiction. Before Harriet Nelson became America's most beloved TV mom, baking cookies in her spotless kitchen and dispensing gentle wisdom to her sons, she was someone completely different. Her real name wasn't even Harriet. Born Peggy Lou Snyder in Des Moines, Iowa, on July 18, 1909, the woman who would become the symbol of wholesome American motherhood had a past that would have shocked the very audience that adored her. While the Harriet Nelson that America knew never seemed to have existed before she appeared on their television screens, perfectly formed and impossibly pure, the real woman had lived an entire lifetime that the show's producers desperately wanted to keep hidden. Young Peggy Lou Snyder wasn't content with the quiet, conventional life that small-town Iowa offered. She craved excitement, glamour, the bright lights of the big city. After finding herself drawn to the New York club scene as a teenager, she made a decision that would have been scandalous if her future fans had known about it. She dropped out of high school. This future symbol of American values and propriety, this woman who would become the embodiment of maternal perfection, walked away from her education to pursue a life in the entertainment world. But it gets even more interesting. The teenage Peggy Lou didn't just dip her toes into the nightlife. She dove in headfirst. She became a regular at the Cotton Club, one of the most famous and notorious nightclubs in Harlem during the Jazz Age. This wasn't just any club. This was a place where the alcohol flowed freely despite prohibition, where the music was hot, where the atmosphere was electric and dangerous and absolutely thrilling. At just 13 years old, she started smoking. 13. Let that sink in for a moment. The woman who would later portray the epitome of maternal virtue, who would be held up as the standard for American mothers everywhere, was lighting up cigarettes as a young teenager in the back rooms of jazz clubs. She kept this habit her entire life, though she was careful never to smoke in public. The image, after all, had to be maintained. Her publicists and the show's producers understood that America's perfect mom couldn't be seen with a cigarette dangling from her lips. That wouldn't fit the carefully crafted narrative they were selling to millions of viewers every week. But here's where Harriet's secret past gets even darker, even more shocking. Before she ever met Ozzie Nelson, before she became Mrs. Nelson and the mother of David and Ricky, Harriet had been married before. Not many people know this. In fact, the show's producers went to great lengths to erase this chapter from her official biography. In 1930, at the age of 21, Peggy Lou Snyder married a comedian named Roy Sedley. On the surface, it might have seemed like a match made in showbiz heaven. Two young entertainers, both chasing their dreams in the glittering world of New York nightlife. But behind closed doors, the marriage was a nightmare. Roy Sedley was abusive. The details of what Harriet endured during that marriage have been largely kept private, protected by the era's reluctance to discuss such matters openly and by Harriet's own desire to move past that painful chapter. What we do know is that Harriet lived what contemporaries described as a high-flying life, a phrase that in the parlance of the time suggested excess, danger, and behavior that polite society frowned upon. The marriage lasted barely a year before they separated, though it would take until 1933 for the union to be officially annulled. Imagine the terror, the disappointment, the disillusionment that young Harriet must have felt. She had left her small-town life behind, dropped out of school, thrown herself into the big city's entertainment world, only to find herself trapped in an abusive marriage before she was even 22 years old. This was the Harriet Nelson that never made it onto America's television screens. This was the woman with cigarette smoke in her lungs and painful memories in her heart. The woman who had seen the dark underbelly of the entertainment world, who had learned hard lessons about trust and appearance versus reality. And yet, just 2 years after her marriage was annulled, in 1935, Harriet married Ozzie Nelson. Was it love? Was it a calculated career move? Was it an escape from her past and a chance to reinvent herself? Perhaps it was all three. What's certain is that from the moment she became Mrs. Ozzie Nelson, Harriet began the process of burying Peggy Lou Snyder forever. Now let's talk about Ozzie Nelson, because if Harriet's past was carefully hidden, Ozzie's control over his family's present and future was perhaps even more disturbing. Oswald George Nelson was born on March 20th, 1906, in Jersey City, New Jersey. Unlike Harriet, Ozzie came from a more conventional background. He was educated, ambitious, and possessed an almost obsessive need for control that would define his career and, tragically, his family's life. He formed a dance band in the early 1930s called Ozzie Nelson and his Orchestra. He wasn't just the band leader. He was a perfectionist who demanded absolute control over every aspect of his musical productions. This need for control, this inability to delegate or trust others, would become the defining characteristic of his personality. When Ozzie discovered Harriet in 1932, performing under her stage name Harriet Hilliard, he saw more than just a talented singer. He saw someone he could mold, someone who could fit perfectly into the image he was creating. They married in October 1935, and almost immediately, Ozzie began orchestrating not just his band, but his entire life as though it were a performance. Their son David was born in 1936, followed by Eric, who would later be known as Ricky, in 1940. From the outside, they looked like a successful showbiz couple with 2 adorable sons. But even then, Ozzie was planning something bigger, something that would consume his entire family. During the 1940s, Ozzie and Harriet had achieved success with Ozzie's orchestra, but the constant touring was wearing. They had 2 young boys who were being raised on the road or by hired help while their parents performed. Ozzie wanted something more stable, more lucrative, and more controllable. Radio beckoned. The idea of a family-based radio show was taking hold in American entertainment, and Ozzie saw an opportunity. But here's where things start to get troubling. When Ozzie initially considered putting his family on the radio, he was apprehensive about including David and Ricky. These were his young sons, children who should have been playing baseball, attending regular schools, having normal childhoods. But the pull of fame and the potential for profit won out over any paternal protectiveness Ozzie might have felt. In 1944, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet premiered on radio. Initially, child actors played the Nelson boys. But as the show grew more popular, Ozzie made a decision that would alter the course of his sons' lives forever. In 1949, he decided that David and Ricky would begin playing themselves on the radio show. They were 13 and 9 years old, respectively. From that moment on, the Nelson boys' childhoods effectively ended. They weren't just Ozzie and Harriet's sons anymore. They were characters, products, commodities to be managed and controlled and exploited for entertainment value. When television came calling in 1952, Ozzie didn't hesitate. The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet made the transition to the small screen, and now America could actually see this perfect family. Ozzie served as the show's star, producer, director, and head writer. He controlled every single aspect of the production. Nothing happened on that set without Ozzie's approval. Every script, every scene, every line of dialogue passed through his hands. His perfectionism, which had served him well as a band leader, now extended to controlling the very lives of his family members. The show was filmed at General Service Studios, but the exterior shots were of the Nelsons' actual home in Los Angeles. The interior sets were meticulously recreated to match their real house. The lines between fiction and reality weren't just blurred. They were deliberately erased. Think about what this meant for young David and Ricky. They would leave their real home to go to a soundstage designed to look exactly like their real home, where they would pretend to live out situations that were supposedly based on their real lives, all while being directed by their real father, who was playing a fictionalized version of himself. The psychological impact of this constant confusion between reality and performance cannot be overstated. Where did the characters end and the real people begin? When they sat at the dinner table at home, were they still performing? When Ozzie gave them direction as a father, Was he speaking as their dad or as their director and boss? Former cast members and crew who worked on The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet have described Ozzie as demanding and controlling to an almost suffocating degree. Behind the scenes, Ozzie's perfectionism kept the show's production smooth and consistent. But at what cost to his family? He managed everything from scripts to sets with an iron fist. The character Ozzie played on television was goofy and slightly befuddled, always creating problems that his wise and patient wife had to solve. But the real Ozzie was nothing like that. He was sharp, calculating, controlling, and perhaps most disturbingly, he seemed unable to separate his role as father from his role as producer and director. Harriet, for her part, played along perfectly. On screen, she was gracious and gentle, the all-purpose mom who solved every problem with a kind word and a knowing smile. In person, people who knew her described her as generally silent in her husband's presence. She had learned, perhaps through her difficult first marriage, when to stay quiet. She had reinvented herself so completely that the brassy, cigarette-smoking nightclub regular was buried so deep that even she might have forgotten that woman ever existed. But she knew the truth. She knew that the perfect marriage and perfect family life they were selling to America was a performance, a carefully constructed illusion. The show ran for an astonishing 14 years, from 1952 to 1966. That's 14 years of David and Ricky's lives spent performing versions of themselves for public consumption. 14 years of having their real experiences mined for script material. 14 years of having their actual home used as a set. 14 years of America watching them grow up, thinking they knew these boys, when in reality no one, perhaps not even David and Ricky themselves, knew who they really were beneath the characters they'd been playing since childhood. Let's focus on what this did to David and Ricky, because their stories are perhaps the most tragic element of this entire deception. David Nelson was born on October 24, 1936. He was the elder son, and as such, he bore the weight of expectations differently than his younger brother. David spent his entire childhood and adolescence performing. He never had a choice in the matter. When he was old enough to understand what was happening, the show was already a success, his face was already famous, and there was no going back. The character of David Nelson on television was clean-cut, responsible, good-natured, the perfect older brother and model teenager. The real David Nelson was trapped in his younger brother's shadow and navigating the impossible challenge of trying to have a real identity while playing himself on television. Imagine trying to rebel or find yourself or make mistakes the way every teenager needs to do, but knowing that millions of people are watching you, expecting you to be the wholesome character they see every week. Imagine trying to date, but the girls you're interested in can't separate you from the character you play. Are they attracted to you or to the fictional David they see on TV? Imagine your father being your boss, your director, the person who controls not just your allowance, but your entire career and public image. How do you develop into your own person under those circumstances? David eventually became a film and television producer and director himself, perhaps trying to reclaim some of the control over his life that his father had exercised for so long. He married actress June Blair in 1961, and the marriage was, of course, written into the show. His real-life wedding became content for the show. His actual wife became a character playing his wife. The layers of performance and reality became even more impossibly tangled. David died on January 11, 2011, of colon cancer. Notably, he is not buried with the rest of his family. Some have speculated about what this might mean. Was it his choice? Was it a final declaration of independence? We may never know, but the question itself speaks volumes about the complicated legacy of the Nelson family. Ricky Nelson's story is even more heartbreaking because while David lived in relative obscurity compared to his brother, Ricky became a teen idol and a genuinely successful musician, which brought its own unique set of pressures and tragedies. Born Eric Hilliard Nelson on May 8, 1940, Ricky was thrown into the spotlight even younger than David. He was only 9 years old when he started playing himself on the radio show, just 12 when the television show began. America watched this little boy grow into a teenager, and as he did, something unexpected happened. Ricky Nelson became a sensation in his own right. In the late 1950s, Ricky started performing songs on the show. His first single, a cover of Fats Domino's I'm Walkin', was released in 1957 and became a massive hit. Suddenly, Ricky wasn't just playing himself on a family sitcom. He was a legitimate rock and roll star. Between 1957 and 1962, Ricky Nelson had more hits than any other artist except Elvis Presley. He was handsome, talented, and beloved. Teenage girls screamed his name. His records sold millions of copies. But this success came with a price that would ultimately destroy him. Ricky's entire adolescence was spent performing. Not just on the TV show, but in concert tours, recording sessions, promotional appearances. He had no private life, no opportunity to figure out who Ricky Nelson was apart from the character and the teen idol persona. And all the while, Ozzie controlled his career, made decisions on his behalf, and continued to blur the lines between Ricky's personal life and the show. When Ricky fell in love with Kristen Harmon in the early 1960s, their courtship and eventual marriage became storylines on the show. Kristen herself joined the cast. Once again, real life became content, privacy became impossible, and the boundaries between person and performance disappeared entirely. Ricky and Kristen married on April 20th, 1963. She was just 17 years old. Some have described it as a shotgun wedding because Kristen was 3 months pregnant. They would go on to have 4 children together: Tracy, twin boys Matthew and Gunnar, and Sam. From the outside, it looked like Ricky had achieved everything. He had the career, the beautiful wife, the growing family. But behind closed doors, Ricky was struggling. The constant pressure, the lack of a real childhood, the confusion about his identity, and the crushing weight of maintaining his image were taking their toll. By the 1970s, Ricky's music career had cooled considerably. Rock and roll had evolved, and the clean-cut teen idol image that had made him famous was now seen as dated. At a concert at Madison Square Garden in 1971, Ricky performed his newer country rock material instead of his old hits, and the audience booed him. He was devastated. Out of that painful experience came his song Garden Party, which included the famous lyric, "You can't please everyone, so you've got to please yourself." It was perhaps the first truly authentic statement Ricky Nelson had ever made publicly. It was a declaration of independence, a refusal to keep playing the role everyone expected of him. The song became his last major hit, reaching number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1972. But by then, the damage was done. Ricky's marriage to Kristen was falling apart. The impasse over Rick's career created unbearable tension at home. Kristen developed a drinking problem and struggled to cope with the pressure of being married to someone who had never really been allowed to become a full person. She later admitted, "I tried to be one of the guys to fix the marriage by going on the road and being involved in road stuff that is really not good for anyone." Both Rick and Kristen accused each other of drug and alcohol abuse. Both accused each other of being poor parents. The divorce proceedings began in 1980 and dragged on for years, becoming increasingly ugly and public. Kristen claimed Rick was hiding assets, though in reality, he was nearly broke. The divorce was finalized in December 1982, and it was financially devastating for Rick. Attorneys and accountants took over $1 million. His career was struggling. His personal life was in shambles. And the man who had been America's favorite teenager was now a middle-aged, has been trying to figure out who he was and how to move forward. Throughout all of this, there were persistent rumors about drug use. Some claimed that Rick had developed serious substance abuse problems, using cocaine and other drugs to cope with the pressure and disappointment. These rumors would follow him for the rest of his life and even beyond it. Meanwhile, Ozzie had died of liver cancer on June 3, 1975. He never lived to see just how badly his sons, particularly Ricky, would struggle in the aftermath of their controlled childhoods. Harriet, for her part, mostly stayed out of the limelight after Ozzie's death and the show's cancellation. She had played her role for so long that perhaps she didn't know who she was without it. She would live until October 2, 1994, passing away from congestive heart failure at the age of 85. But Ricky's story wasn't over yet, and the final chapter would be the most tragic of all. By 1985, Rick Nelson was 45 years old and trying to rebuild his career. He was touring regularly, playing smaller venues, trying to reclaim some of the magic that had made him famous decades earlier. On December 31, 1985, New Year's Eve, Rick and his band were traveling on a chartered Douglas DC-3 aircraft from Gunnersville, Alabama, to Dallas, Texas, where Rick was scheduled to perform a New Year's Eve concert. The plane was an older model, built in the 1940s, but it was still considered airworthy. Somewhere during that flight, a fire broke out in the cabin. The details of what happened next have been the subject of investigation, speculation, and controversy for decades. What we know for certain is that the pilots attempted an emergency landing in a field near DeKalb, Texas. The plane crash-landed and 7 people died: Rick Nelson, his fiancée Helen Blair, and 5 members of his band. The pilot and co-pilot survived, as did Rick's sound engineer Rick Intveld. The official investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board concluded in 1987 that the most likely cause of the fire was a faulty cabin heater or an electrical short. But before that official report was released, rumors spread like wildfire. Just 2 weeks after the crash, the Washington Post published a front-page story titled "Drug-Related Fire Suspected in Rick Nelson Plane Crash." The article suggested that Rick and his band members had been freebasing cocaine in the cabin, and that the fire had started from their drug paraphernalia. These rumors gained traction quickly, particularly among people who remembered Rick Nelson as the wholesome teenager from television and wanted a sensational fall-from-grace narrative. Rick's family fought desperately to clear his name. They pointed to the NTSB's eventual conclusion that the heater was to blame, not drugs. Toxicology reports on the victims showed no signs of drug use at the time of the crash. But the damage was done. In death, as in life, Rick Nelson couldn't escape the prison of his public image. Think about the cruel irony of this for a moment. Rick Nelson had spent his entire life trapped by the image that his father had created for him, unable to be his authentic self, struggling with the weight of expectations and the confusion of never having a private identity. And then, when he died in a tragic accident, that same public that had created those expectations immediately turned on him, eager to believe that the wholesome teenager they'd loved had become a drug-addled burnout. Even in death, Rick couldn't escape the performance. The question of what really caused that fire may never be fully answered to everyone's satisfaction. What we do know is that Ricky Nelson died at 45, after a life spent trying to figure out who he was beyond the character his father had created and the teen idol image the public demanded he maintain. His children, particularly his twin sons Matthew and Gunnar, who would later form their own band called Nelson, have spoken about the complexity of their father's legacy and the horrible Hollywood divorce their parents went through. Sam, Rick's youngest son, was so affected by his mother's subsequent struggles with addiction that he was temporarily placed in the custody of his uncle, actor Mark Harmon, and Aunt Pam Dauber. Kristen Nelson never fully recovered from Rick's death and her own struggles. She died on April 27, 2018, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, having battled addiction for much of her life. The tragedy of the Nelson family extended to the next generation, proving that the trauma of Ozzie's controlling perfectionism and the prison of public performance had generational consequences. Now let's step back and look at the bigger picture of what The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet represented and what its dark reality tells us about American culture in the 1950s and beyond. The show aired during a unique moment in American history. The country had just emerged from World War II and was entering a period of unprecedented prosperity. The economy was booming, suburbs were sprawling, and television was becoming the center of family life. Americans wanted stability, normalcy, and reassurance that everything was going to be okay. They wanted to believe in the American dream, the idea that with hard work and wholesome values, anyone could have a perfect life. The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet sold that dream more effectively than perhaps any other show of its era. It was more convincing than Leave It to Beaver or Father Knows Best because it starred a real family. These weren't actors playing the Nelsons. These were the actual Nelsons, or so the audience believed. If this real family could be so perfect, so harmonious, so problem-free, then surely that life was achievable for everyone. The show set an impossible standard. It told American families that they should look like the Nelsons, act like the Nelsons, solve problems like the Nelsons. It said that fathers should be gentle and well-meaning, that mothers should be patient and wise, that teenagers should be respectful and wholesome, and that family conflicts should be minor and resolvable in 22 minutes. But it was all a lie. The Nelsons weren't really like that. No family was. The show created a myth of American family life that was so powerful it still influences our culture today. When politicians talk about family values and the good old days, they're often referencing a sanitized false memory of shows like Ozzie and Harriet. They're romanticizing an era that never actually existed except on television screens. Meanwhile, the real Nelson family was paying the price for maintaining this illusion. Harriet was hiding her past, smoking in private, playing a character that bore little resemblance to the woman she had been. Ozzie was obsessively controlling every aspect of his family's lives, unable to separate his roles as father and producer. David and Ricky were growing up in a bizarre fishbowl where their real lives were constantly being mined for content, and their true identities were being suppressed in favor of the characters they played. The psychological impact on David and Ricky was profound. Child stars often struggle with identity formation because they're rewarded for performing rather than for being themselves. But the Nelson boys had it even worse because they were playing themselves. They couldn't even have the separation that comes from playing a character with a different name. When people praised them, were they praising the real David and Ricky or the fictional versions? When they looked in the mirror, who did they see? This confusion between self and performance is something that trauma experts now recognize can cause lasting psychological damage. It's telling that both David and Ricky struggled in different ways after the show ended. David remained in the industry, but never achieved the same level of fame, perhaps because he was trying to step out of the shadow of both his famous family and his own childhood character. Ricky achieved independent success, but couldn't sustain it and struggled with substance abuse and relationship problems. Neither of them had a normal, healthy childhood. Neither of them was given the chance to develop a solid sense of self before being thrust into the public eye and expected to maintain a perfect image. The show also did something insidious to American culture that we're still grappling with today. It established the idea that we could know public figures intimately, that we could see into their real lives through television. It was one of the first reality shows, in a sense. It claimed to show a real family living their real life, and audiences believed it. This created an expectation that public figures owe us access to their private lives, that there's no boundary between public and private when you're famous. This is a mentality that fuels modern celebrity culture and social media, where people share or are expected to share every aspect of their lives for public consumption. But the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet proved that what we see is never the whole story. The more perfect the image, the more likely it is that something darker is being hidden behind it. The more someone insists that their life is wholesome and problem-free, the more we should question what's really going on behind closed doors. Ozzie Nelson's obsessive control over the show's production and his family's image wasn't born from a place of love or care. It was born from a place of insecurity and a need to present a perfect facade to the world. The question is, why did he need that facade so badly? What was he trying to hide or compensate for? Some who knew Ozzie have suggested that he was a deeply insecure man who found validation only through control and success. The character he played on television, the bumbling but lovable father, was perhaps closer to how he feared people saw him if he wasn't carefully managing every detail. So he controlled everything he could. He controlled his band, his radio show, his television show, and tragically, his family. He made sure that the public version of the Nelsons was beyond reproach. But in doing so, he robbed his sons of their childhoods and his family of any chance at genuine privacy or authenticity. Harriet's complicity in this is worth examining too. She had reinvented herself so completely, had buried Peggy Lou Snyder so deep, that she was perhaps terrified of anyone discovering her real past. The wild teenager smoking in jazz clubs, the young woman in an abusive marriage, the person she had been before becoming America's perfect mom. All of that had to stay hidden. So she played along with Ozzie's control. She stayed silent. She performed her role perfectly. And in doing so, she sacrificed not just her own authenticity, but also enabled the sacrificing of her sons' well-being for the sake of maintaining the illusion. There's a particular kind of cruelty in using your own children for entertainment purposes while telling yourself and the world that you're just sharing your beautiful family life. Modern discussions about family vlogging and child influencers on social media often reference this exact dynamic. When does sharing your family become exploitation? When does involving your children in your career become robbing them of their childhood? The Nelson family is perhaps the first major example of this in American entertainment history, and the outcomes were clearly negative. Yet we as a society haven't learned the lesson. We're still fascinated by famous families. We still want to peer into their lives. We still create markets and demand for this kind of content, and children continue to pay the price. The show's legacy is complicated. On one hand, it was groundbreaking. It was one of the longest-running sitcoms in television history. It launched Ricky Nelson's music career and gave him a platform that many artists would envy. It provided entertainment to millions of people and became a cultural touchstone for an entire generation. Many people have fond memories of watching the Nelsons' adventures, and those memories are valid. But we can't ignore the cost. We can't pretend that everything was fine behind the scenes just because the show made us feel good. The dark secret of Ozzie and Harriet isn't just one shocking revelation. It's not just that Harriet had a secret past, or that Ricky died in a plane crash, or that the boys grew up under crushing pressure. The dark secret is that the entire thing was a fabrication. The secret is that America's most wholesome family was performing wholesomeness as a career, and that performance damaged everyone involved. The secret is that the perfect life we all thought we saw was a carefully controlled illusion maintained by a perfectionist father and a mother who had buried her true self so deep that maybe even she forgot who she really was. This isn't to say that Ozzie and Harriet were evil people. They probably thought they were doing the right thing. Ozzie probably believed that he was giving his sons opportunities, exposing them to the entertainment industry, building something lasting for his family. Harriet probably believed that she had left behind a troubled past to build a better life. But the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and the Nelson family story is a cautionary tale about the price of perfection, the danger of prioritizing image over reality, and the damage that can be done when we sacrifice authenticity for public approval. In the decades since the show ended, our culture has become even more obsessed with celebrity, with reality television, with the lives of public figures. We've learned nothing from the Nelsons' tragedy. If anything, we've doubled down, creating an entire economy around people sharing their supposedly real lives for public consumption. But the Nelson family's story should make us question all of it. It should make us wonder what we're really seeing when we watch reality shows or follow influencers on social media. It should make us consider what price those people, and especially their children, are paying for our entertainment. Rick Nelson's death in 1985 brought some of these questions to the forefront, at least temporarily. Here was America's favorite teenager, now middle-aged and struggling, dying in a tragic accident that was immediately surrounded by ugly rumors. The public that had loved him couldn't wait to believe the worst about him. It was an ugly reminder that the same people who build you up will tear you down with equal enthusiasm. Rick had spent his whole life trying to meet expectations, trying to be who everyone wanted him to be. And in the end, it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough because the expectations were based on a fiction, a character, a perfectly scripted version of life that doesn't exist. David Nelson lived longer, passing away in 2011. But by most accounts, he spent much of his life trying to figure out who he was beyond the shadow of the show and his more famous brother. He worked steadily in the entertainment industry, but he never sought the spotlight the way he'd been forced to stand in it as a child. His choice not to be buried with the rest of his family might have been a final act of independence, a declaration that he was his own person, separate from the Nelson family myth. Or maybe it was just a practical decision with no deeper meaning. We'll never know for sure, but the question itself is revealing. Harriet lived to be 85, outliving both her husband and her son Ricky by many years. She remained, by all accounts, a private person in her later years, rarely giving interviews or making public appearances. The woman who had played America's mom for 14 years retreated from view, perhaps exhausted from decades of performance, perhaps relieved to finally be allowed to stop pretending. She took most of her secrets with her. The full story of Peggy Lou Snyder, of her time at the Cotton Club, of her abusive first marriage, of what she really thought about the show and the life she'd lived, all of that died with her. What we're left with is a complicated legacy. We have hundreds of episodes of a television show that portrayed an idealized American family. We have the music that Ricky Nelson created, much of which remains genuinely good and influential. We have the memories of millions of people who loved the show and found comfort in it. But we also have the darker truth. We have Ricky's struggles with addiction and his tragic death. We have the reality that two young boys were robbed of normal childhoods and forced to grow up performing versions of themselves for public consumption. We have the knowledge that Ozzie's controlling perfectionism created an environment where authenticity was impossible and privacy was non-existent. The question we should ask ourselves is, what do we do with this knowledge? Do we simply write off the show as a product of its time and move on? Do we stop watching old episodes or enjoying Ricky Nelson's music? I don't think that's necessary or even helpful. But what we should do is use this story as a lens through which to examine our own cultural consumption. When we watch reality shows or follow family influencers or consume content that purports to show us real people's real lives, we should remember the Nelsons. We should remember that what we're seeing is always a performance to some degree. We should remember that there's always a cost to that performance, and often that cost is being paid by people who didn't choose it, particularly children. We should also use this story to question the myth of the perfect family. The adventures of Ozzie and Harriet set a standard that was always impossible to meet because it was never real in the first place. Yet that standard has haunted American families for decades. How many people have felt inadequate because their families don't look like the Nelsons? How many marriages have struggled because partners expected their spouse to be as understanding as TV Harriet or as good-natured as TV Ozzie? How many parents have felt like failures because their teenagers weren't as respectful and problem-free as TV David and Ricky? The damage caused by impossible standards is real and lasting. The truth is that all families are messy. All families have problems. All families have secrets. That's not a bug, it's a feature. It's part of being human. The problem isn't that the Nelson family had issues. The problem is that they pretended they didn't and sold that pretense to millions of people who believed it was achievable. The problem is that Ozzie's need for control and Harriet's need to hide her past resulted in their children being sacrificed to maintain an image. The problem is that we as a society rewarded this behavior, made it profitable, and then did it again and again with other families. Looking back now from our current vantage point, it's easy to see the problems with what the Nelsons did. But at the time, they were pioneers. They didn't have the benefit of hindsight or the cautionary tales that we have now. They didn't know what the cost would be of blurring the lines between public and private, between performance and reality. They couldn't have predicted how the show would shape American culture's expectations of family life, or how it would impact their own children's mental health and development. In some ways, they were victims of their own success. The show was so popular, so beloved, that they couldn't stop. It had taken on a life of its own. Millions of people depended on the Nelsons for their weekly dose of comfort and wholesomeness. The economic engine that the show created employed many people and generated significant income. How do you walk away from that? How do you tell your children that actually you're done, even though it means disappointing millions of fans and giving up financial security? These are impossible questions, and I'm not sure there are easy answers. But that's precisely why the story is important. It illustrates the complex moral questions that arise when family and career become entangled, when private life becomes public commodity, when image becomes more important than reality. Ozzie Nelson probably didn't wake up one day and decide to exploit his children. It happened gradually, one decision at a time, each one seeming reasonable in the moment. First, it was just a radio show. Then child actors played his sons, so the real boys weren't affected. Then the boys started playing themselves on the radio, but that seemed fine because it was just voices. Then it was a television show, but surely that was just an extension of what they were already doing. Then their real lives were being written into scripts, but those things were happening anyway, so why not share them? Before anyone realized what was happening, the entire family was trapped in a web of performance and public expectation from which there was no escape. This gradual erosion of boundaries is something we should be especially aware of in our current digital age. Social media makes it easier than ever to share our lives publicly. Many people, particularly influencers and content creators, involve their children in their online presence. Each individual post or video might seem harmless. But what's the cumulative effect? What happens when those children grow up and realize that their entire childhood was documented and shared with strangers? What happens when they want to develop identities separate from their parents' brands? The Nelson family story suggests that the consequences can be severe and lasting. Another aspect of this story worth considering is the role of the audience. We, the viewers, the fans, the consumers of this content, were not passive in this dynamic. The show existed because there was demand for it. People wanted to see the perfect family. They wanted to believe that such a life was possible. In some ways, the American public of the 1950s and 60s was complicit in what happened to the Nelson children because they created the market that made it profitable to exploit them. This isn't about assigning individual blame to people who watched and enjoyed the show. But collectively, we should recognize that our desire for certain types of content creates incentives for people to produce that content, even when it's harmful to those involved. This dynamic continues today. Every time we click on a family vlogger's video, or like an influencer's post featuring their children, we're contributing to an economy that incentivizes the exploitation of those children's privacy and potentially their well-being. We have the power to change this by being more conscious consumers, by asking questions about consent and impact, by refusing to support content that we suspect might be harmful to the people creating it. The Nelson family couldn't have been stopped by individual viewers making different choices, but the cultural attitudes that enabled and celebrated what happened to them could have been different if more people had questioned what they were seeing. It's also worth noting that the Nelson story is part of a larger pattern in Hollywood and the entertainment industry. Child stars have been exploited for over a century. The list of child actors who struggled with addiction, mental health issues, financial problems, and identity crises is long and heartbreaking. From Judy Garland to Drew Barrymore to countless others, the pattern repeats. Some child stars do manage to transition into healthy adulthood, but the odds are not in their favor. The industry chews up children and spits them out, and we all watch and consume and move on to the next one without really considering the human cost. What makes the Nelson family unique is that they weren't just child actors. They were being exploited by their own father, in their own home, while maintaining the fiction that it was all just a natural extension of their real family life. That's a particularly insidious form of exploitation because it makes it impossible to separate work from home, career from family, performance from reality. At least when child actors play characters with different names on sound stages that don't look like their real homes, there's some boundary, however thin, between their real lives and their work. David and Ricky Nelson didn't have even that small protection. As we come to the end of this deep dive into the dark secrets of Ozzie and Harriet, I want to return to where we started. That image of the perfect American family, smiling on our television screens, representing everything that was supposed to be wholesome and good about 1950s America. Now that we know the truth, that image takes on a different meaning. It becomes a symbol not of perfection, but of the price of perfection. It becomes a reminder that things are rarely what they seem. It becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing image over reality, public approval over personal well-being, success over authenticity. The dark secret of Ozzie and Harriet is that there was no perfect family. There never is. The secret is that Harriet was hiding a past that would have scandalized her audience. The secret is that Ozzie was a controlling perfectionist who couldn't separate his roles as father and producer. The secret is that David and Ricky were robbed of normal childhoods and struggled to develop healthy identities. The secret is that Ricky turned to drugs to cope with the pressure and died tragically at 45. The secret is that the whole thing was a performance, and everyone involved paid a price for it. But perhaps the darkest secret of all is that we, as a society, learn nothing from this. We continue to celebrate and consume content that exploits families and children. We continue to hold up impossible standards of family perfection. We continue to believe that what we see on screens, whether television or computer or phone, is reality. The Nelson family's tragedy should have been a wake-up call, but instead, it was just a preview of things to come. So the next time you see a perfect family on social media or reality TV, remember Ozzie and Harriet. Remember that perfection is always a performance. Remember that there's always a cost, and that cost is usually being paid by the people who had the least choice in the matter. Remember that behind every perfect image is a real human being with struggles and secrets and pain. And maybe, just maybe, we can start to build a culture that values authenticity over perfection, that protects children instead of exploiting them, and that recognizes that the messy, complicated, imperfect reality of family life is far more valuable than any carefully constructed illusion could ever be.